All right. So, David, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very fine. Looking forward to the show, and I put together a couple of articles to share with you and the audience. And well, we can go an in-depth discussion on communism, the history of it, the ideological history of it. We can talk about all the way through the development of Bolshevism in Russia, and then the transformation of Russia from a communist country to a nationalist country, and why the globalists hate Russia today.
Yeah, because when you see in modern media this whole Trump-Russia collusion narrative, it does seem that some people in the media have a big problem with Trump and they have a big problem with Russia. And if you look at the evidence, there's so little of it that one wonders, why is it the case? And I think that your explanation, your historical view of Russia can help us understand that. I've read about the history of Jews in Russia. I was not aware of this. I read about all of it today. And it's pretty amazing. Jews have been there for a long time. And for a certain moment in history, Russia was the place in the world where there was the biggest Jewish community.
Absolutely. And the worldwide Jewish establishment, the globalist establishment, supported the rise of Bolshevism in Russia. In fact, you can read in the Encyclopedia Judaica and the Jewish Encyclopedia, they even say in that, and I copied that on my book, The Secret Behind Communism, which we can talk about today a lot. I copied the article where they said practically every synagogue in the world supported Russia, the Bolshevik revolution in Russia, with money, food, clothes, success, and support all over the world. Pretty amazing statement. That was published by the World Jewish Encyclopedia, which was published by the major and the leading Jewish organizations of the entire world, a well-known encyclopedia for the Jewish people, made by the Jewish people. And they actually said, they even talked about it close to that time, talking about every synagogue in the world, they said. And that's their words, was supporting the Bolsheviks in Russia. And the ironic thing is that it was not simply communist Jews. It was also people such as Jacob Schiff, who was a huge capitalist in America, Federal Reserve guy, and very, very rich capitalist in New York, who supported the Bolshevik Revolution. Pretty amazing stuff, and it's interesting because when you consider that communism is an atheist ideology, or an ideology that says that God doesn't exist, as a basic core idea. Karl Marx himself, said that religion is the opiate of the people, and he was an atheist himself, even though he came from a long line of rabbis. It's really interesting when you see the Jewish organized community, the elite all over the world supporting communism, and by the way, the New York Times is part of that as well.
And it's pretty amazing that when you understand the position of Jews in Russia historically, World War II starts making much more sense. One of the elements that I didn't understand yet about World War II was, why was the USSR on the side of the UK? And when you understand where Jews were positioned historically, it comes to be very clear. Jews were present in Russia somewhere between the 7th and 14th century, and there were many moments in Russian history where they were excluded from main society, and there were dedicated places for them to live, right?
Absolutely. They had an entire area of Russia which was set aside for Jewish settlement. However, the Jews of the world didn't want to go there, even though it ended up being very rich in oil and other resources. They wanted to go to Palestine. And, of course, they flooded into Palestine, and they ultimately drove out 600,000 Palestinians from their homes with terrorism, mass murder. And, in fact, not only did they terrorize the Palestinians, such as derrière, Menachem Begin and these other Jews. And, by the way, Menachem Begin was another one of these essentially communist Jews. He supported communism in Eastern Europe. And the Jewish state itself had a very, very close relationship with communism. The only country that beat America in recognizing the Zionist state of Israel was Russia. We did it in 3 minutes. They did it in a minute and a half.
All right. So the moment at which Jews started traveling to what is now Israel, from my understanding, this dates back to before World War II, right?
Yes, absolutely. All the way back to the beginning of the 20th century, they had this plan, and they wanted to massively immigrate there. And it's interesting if you actually look at the history of Palestine, the Arabs were having massive protests because after the First World War, when the immigration really started in earnest, the British mandate had control over the region. And they were allowing this massive Jewish immigration, and it was against the will, obviously, of the Palestinian people who saw this as a threat. And of course, they were correct. But the British government continued to allow this. This is part of the Balfour Declaration. In fact, the history of the Balfour Declaration is very, very interesting because the Balfour Declaration was the declaration that was done between the British government and the Rothschilds, one of the most powerful Jewish banking houses in the world, obviously, Baron von Rothschild. And this declaration was an agreement between world Jewry and American Jewry and the British government that if the British established a principle of Jewish invasion, basically, of Palestine, in the Balfour Declaration, the idea of a Jewish national home, that they would, in fact, as payment to Great Britain, they would use their influence in the United States of America to get America into the war on the side of Britain. And the Jewish establishment, in fact, did that in the United States of America. We had 167,000 Americans die in the First World War. The First World War was one of those insane wars. 37 million Europeans died in that war, 167,000 Americans and many others wounded and harmed. And that was because of the influence of organizations and publications like the New York Times and also tremendous Jewish influence in government. Bernard Baruch was one of the chief financiers of the United States of America. He was also an aide to President Wilson. And then you had a massive element in America getting America into the First World War, not for the interest of America. It wasn't a war for democracy. Germany was a democracy just like any other country at that time in the First World War. It was really a war for Israel. And so we had 167,000 Americans die in that war, so that the Balfour Declaration, and by the way, the Balfour Declaration was kind of a bait and switch operation, like a sales thing when, you say, come, take a look at this car. It's a cheap price. Then you get there and everything's changed at the dealership. The Balfour Declaration promised to totally respect the rights of the indigenous people of Palestine, the Palestinian people who lived there for 2,000 years, were the vast majority. They were over 95% of Palestine at the turn of the 20th century. They've been living there for thousands of years. They even lived there. Then the evidence is pretty obvious. The Philistines and the others who became Palestinians, they lived there long before the early Jewish invasions as recorded by the Bible. And many of them suffered holocausts and genocides at the hands of the invaders at that time. So they came up with this idea that, well, we lived there 2,000 years ago, so we have the right to the land. If that's true, then every nation's got a big problem. Every tribe of every nation has a problem because obviously throughout all of history, there's been demographic changes all over the world.
So within World War I, is there already a communist rising emerging, or does that happen after?
Absolutely, there was a communist uprising going on. In 1915-16, at that time, Jacob Schiff, who was one of the richest Jewish bankers in America, was supporting the Bolshevik Revolution. And by the way, he was not only a communist or supporting Bolshevism, he was the biggest single contributor, money bags, behind the Bolshevik Revolution. He gave something like $17 million, which is equivalent to almost like $1 billion in today's money. And he was supporting the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Now, this was a revolution that ultimately led to the greatest mass murder of all time, and maybe that's where we should begin our discussion, is this talk about what was the effect of communism in the world. I mean, how many lives did communism cost? I mean, how much human suffering has communism committed in this world? All we hear about basically is the Nazis and the quote unquote Holocaust. They don't talk about the other Holocaust. Now, believe it or not, the communist mass murder was also called the Holocaust. In fact, the United States Congress referred to the mass killings, I can give you an exact quote, I have the document in front of me, collectively as an unprecedented imperial communist Holocaust. And the victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, established by the United States Congress, refer to the subject as, quote, the communist Holocaust. Now, how many people died? According to the Congress of the United States at the time, it was 94 million people were victims of the Holocaust. How many people actually died? Well, let's just give you the leading historians on the matter. In fact, this is accepted by most mainstream historians around the world. The term Red Holocaust was used by historian Horst Moeller, Professor Stephen Rosefielde, and also, according to historian Alexandra Leganel-Levenstein, historians and philosophers close to political liberal groups in Europe, especially Romania, have made the term Red Holocaust a part of the vocabulary, right? So how many people died? Let's just look at some of the data behind the deaths of communism. Now, we usually say if an ideology causes people to die, it's pretty evil ideology, because under this ideology, people have been murdered by the tens of millions. R.J. Rummel is one of the greatest authorities on the Holocaust. He even wrote in 1993, quote, even were we to have total access to all communist archives, we still would not be able to calculate precisely how many communists were murdered by the communists. Now consider that even in spite of the archival statistics and detailed reports of survivors, the best experts still disagree by over 40% on the total number of Jews killed by the Germans, the National Socialists. I'm talking about mainstream here. We can't expect near this accuracy for victims of communism, but we can get a probable order of magnitude and a relative approximation of these deaths within a most likely range. And the reason why, by the way, we're not able to get this material that we should have is because the access of the murderers, we have no access to the documents. However, when communism was overthrown in Russia, and in the process of the Russians taking back control of their country, they released a lot of the documents in Russia, and they released the documents dealing with things like the Holodomor, with the mass murders, the gulags, and so we got an idea of it. Now, according to R.J. Rummel, who's considered the best authority, in his book Death by Government, 1994, about 110 million foreign and domestic were killed by communist, what they call democide, from 1900 to 1987. In the introduction to the Black Book of Communism, 1999, Stephanie Courtois gives a rough approximation based on unofficial estimates approaching 100 million killed. In his foreword to the book, Martin Melia, another authority, noted a grand total of victims variously estimated by contributors to the volume at between 85 and 100 million. According, and we could just go on and on. In 2005, R.J. Rummel did a revising of his estimates of total communist deaths between 1900 and 1999, upward by 38 million to about 148 million. And that came about because of the recent publications about Mao's role in the absolute murderous program of so-called land reform in China, which caused so many millions of people to die. So they actually revised it up to 143 million people. Now, some other people say, including Jews, say that it's less than that. But what's their estimate? Well, here's a good example. Professor Stephen Kotkin wrote in the Wall Street Journal that communism killed at least 65 million people between 1917 and 2017. So even the apologists for communism admit in many scientifically created and historically detailed and researched books that the communists killed tens of millions of people, not only in Russia and Eastern European countries where they took control, but in other nations such as in Red China. And so the question arises from the very beginning when you start learning about this horrific toll of communism. The question arises, and it's a very good question, why don't we hear about it? We never hear about the communist Holocaust of Christians and others. We don't have, there's no real movies about it. You have thousands of Holocaust memorials all over the world for Jewish victims of the Holocaust. You have Holocaust museums in every country. Almost every state of the United States has Holocaust museums or similar events such as that. You have thousands of articles published in America every month and all over the world every month about the Jewish Holocaust, and you just don't get any about the communists. And so the question arises, why? Why do we hear about the German allegations of mass murder against the Jews every day of our lives, but we don't hear anything about or almost nothing about the communists? And never is communism associated in general speech making or general allegation by mainstream, even communists, with the death of so many millions of people. I think the total is at least 100 million. I would say more precisely it's between 85 and 100 million, but I believe it's at least 100 million. And I think that most major historians who study the issue would agree with those kind of figures.
All right. Now, what was the motivation between this mass murder? Was it to ethnically cleanse? Was it because there were political opponents?
I think there was a great deal of ethnic cleansing, because what happened in Russia was that communism was in fact a Jewish movement, and the Jewish leaders and the Jewish establishment all over the world supported the communist revolution. Communism was Jewish almost from its inception. In fact, even the ideology of communism, and in fact Karl Marx writes about this. Karl Marx gives Moses Hess, a Jewish philosopher and writer, credit for his communist ideas. He actually himself gives credit for it. In fact, I have a document, I have a big advertisement for a huge conference in Israel that celebrates Moses Hess. And they call Moses Hess the father of communism. In fact, but at the same time, Moses Hess, not only was he the father of ideological communism, he was also the father of, in many ways, the Zionist movement. He preceded people like Herzl in terms of calling for a Jewish state. In fact, after the state of Israel was created, they actually dug up his body, his remains, in Europe, and they reburied him in Israel with full honors. And he was an open communist, but also a Zionist. The Zionist state of Israel was in many ways a communist. There were many communists involved in the very beginning of the state of Israel. The Labor Party was essentially a communist party. The whole idea of the kibbutz system was based on communism. A perfect example of this is Bernie Sanders. Now, Bernie Sanders is a young man of 22 years old, went to Israel to stay on a kibbutz. He actually went to a kibbutz which was an openly Stalinist kibbutz. And when he came back to America, he brought back the Soviet red flag with the hammer and sickle and the red flag, which he displayed in his mayoral office for years and years in Burlington, Vermont. He was a communist. He actually was an elector for the Socialist Workers' Party, which considers itself the true progenitor of the Bolshevik Red Army and the original Bolshevik Party. It's a Trotskyite party. It calls itself a communist party, and Sanders himself was on the ballot as an elector for the Socialist Workers' Party, an openly Trotskyite communist party, as an elector for the President of the United States for their candidate.
Pretty fascinating that what we're talking about is so far in history, but it does have impacts today in today's world with people like Bernie Sanders, who we can see on TV every day. I hear that there was within the Jewish community disagreements about communism. Some people didn't agree with Bolshevism. Are you aware of that?
Well, of course, there were, and the biggest struggle was really between those Jews who believed in some of these prophecies. They actually believed in the domination of the world, and that sounds really kooky to a lot of people. But even Ben Gurion, who was the founder of the modern state of Israel, he was like the George Washington of Israel. I hate to even use his name with George Washington in the same breath. But Ben Gurion actually wrote a prophecy. Look magazine asked leaders around the world to write how they saw the world changing over the next few decades. And Ben Gurion wrote a prophecy, his idea of what the world would be like. Now, these other people wrote about scientific achievements and medical advances, and they wrote about hopefully more peaceful world and all that. Ben Gurion wrote that he believed that a new United Nations would be formed. There already was a United Nations, but he said, quote, a truly United Nations would be formed, and that all armies would be abolished. So we'd have world government and absolute world control by a new United Nations. And he also said that this newly established United Nations would be their headquarters would be in Israel. And he said specifically, I mean, this is crazy stuff, but this is what he says, that the headquarters would be in Israel, and that the new United Nations would build a shrine to the Jewish prophets. So for those Christian Zionists listening, he wasn't talking about a shrine to Christians and values, because Judaism is extremely anti-Jesus Christ, anti-Christ, and anti-Christian in its makeup. But he actually said the United Nations would build a shrine to the Jewish prophets. He also said that there would be a world court which would have the ultimate authority on planet Earth, and this world court would be headquartered in Jerusalem, in the center of the Jews. So they'd build a shrine to Jewish prophets. And this would decide all conflicts and all issues around the world. So this was the real struggle between the so-called communist Jews and the Zionist Jews. The ironic thing is that even though some, Zionists went against the communists, they did it kind of as an internal struggle, because the communist organization and the Bolshevik movement was supported by many Zionists around the world. I gave you an example. The biggest single contributor of communism was a capitalist Jewish guy by the name of Jacob Schiff in America, of all places. So it was a worldwide effort by these Zionists. So there's always been this unholy relationship between both Zionists and communists. By the way, in Israel, they built massive memorials to the Red Army. Yad Vashem is the Holocaust memorial in Israel. The ironic thing about Yad Vashem is it sits right across the valley in sight of one of the worst atrocities in the history of Israel, which was the massacre at Der Yassin. And Dr. Winois, who was the United Nations, he's a French doctor that was on the site, gave the most horrific description of this massacre. They massacred about 200 Palestinian, mainly old men, children, and women, including pregnant women, and they just bayoneted their wombs. I mean, it was the worst massacre. And then Menachem Begin, in his book, in fact, Night, Menachem Begin brags about the fact that they publicized this terror and this mass murder as a means of terrorizing the Palestinians and making them flee so their families wouldn't be massacred. So they went through the streets and publicized and even put in their publications pictures of the massacred Arabs and the massacred men, women, and children to terrorize them and make them flee. And then when they fled to protect their families, they wouldn't let them to return home. Now, every country, including the United States of America, the National Security Council, the United Nations as a whole, every international body, practically every president has endorsed the idea of the right of return. The Palestinians should have the right to return to their homes, their businesses, their farms, their lives, when they were driven out through terrorism and murder and forcibly evacuated from their own country, from their own land. And of course, nothing's ever happened. There's been no sanctions on Israel for this enormous crime. They've also, according to even human rights groups in Israel itself, they've tortured over 150,000 Palestinians in their prisons. I mean, it's unbelievable, the story of Israel. And they've also expanded. They invaded Lebanon, where they killed about 40,000 Lebanese. More than half of them were Christians, because the Christians were more located in the southern part of Lebanon. Murdered them, bombed them, killed them, great atrocities. They also invaded Syria, where they took over the Golan Heights. That also was voted upon by America to have Israel, leave that area. But getting back to the communist issue, the fascinating thing was that even the kibbutz system, there were many, many, many communists in the state of Israel. And today, the Jewish community, as far as their political orientation, is toward cultural Marxism. They're very Marxist. The New York Times has been a pro-Marxist paper for a long time. I think I sent you a graphic of the New York Times on Karl Marx's birthday. Do you have that graphic?
Yep, certainly. The New York Times.
See if you can show it for the audience.
Happy birthday, Karl Marx. You were right. That's in April 2018.
That's the New York Times. It's America's leading paper. Happy birthday, Karl Marx. Now, the New York Times is completely owned. It's the only people that have real power in terms of the running of the New York Times. It's not controlled by the average stockholder like most corporations are. The New York Times is controlled by people. I have another graphic. Did I send you the graphic of the owners there? I can also get that up for you from my data. Let me see if I can find it. There you go. So there you go. So now this, we've had 120 years of the New York Times, the total Jewish ownership of the Times, and they're the names for everybody to take a look at: Daniel Cohen, James Cohen, Lynn Tholnick, Susan Dreyfus, Michael Golden, Eric M. Lax, Arthur Schultzberger, Kathy Schultzberger. Now, these are all Jews that support the Zionist state of Israel, a foreign state, a foreign religious state, which is very arguably a far more criminal state than Iran. In fact, Iran hasn't invaded any other countries like Israel has. Iran hasn't kicked out the indigenous people from their country. And as far as Iran being a source of terrorism, Iran is not a source of terrorism. It's not Iranians that are committing all these horrible ISIS crimes and Al-Qaeda crimes in Europe. It's all supported. These crimes are being committed by these groups that have been aided by not only Israel. Israel has not only supported ISIS and Al-Qaeda fighters in Syria, they've also been in alliance with Saudi Arabia, which is a Sharia law radical Zionist state. So they wanted ISIS and Al-Qaeda as a way to divide and conquer Syria. And with the divided Syria, they thought they could more easily just take over the Golan Heights, even though even America voted that Israel had to give this back. So this is really shocking stuff, because most Americans have no idea, but just like they have no idea about the death toll of communism. So the question is, why don't Americans or Europeans really have the right to hear the true story about the death toll of communism? And I would argue that the people who have been behind communism have been overwhelmingly the Jewish establishment. And I think the New York Times is still that way. And I believe the Washington Post is still that way. 80% of the Jewish population routinely votes for the most leftist Marxist group. And the New York Times has other articles. There's another article by New York Times. You can see it there. I think I sent you a copy. And it shows when Americans were inspired by communism. It's a fawning pro-communist article, which was done just a few months ago, before the one with Karl Marx. So the reason why one of the reasons why they wanted the Russian Revolution, again, at that point they saw communism as a way. Well, I tell you what, let me go to another Jewish writer to explain this for your audience, if you like.
All right.
There's an excellent book on Winston Churchill by a Jewish writer, famous Jewish writer named Martin Gilbert. He also did the history of Zionism in Israel. And this book is called Churchill and the Jews. And the book goes into the history of Churchill and how Churchill, basically the theme of the book is, and by the way, this is the official biographer of Churchill. I'm not talking about just some obscure Jewish writer somewhere. This guy was knighted by the British government as the chief, what do you call it? The chief biographer of Winston Churchill, the official British biographer of Winston Churchill. So he goes into the fact that Baron von Rothschild rescued the Churchill family, which had peerage and obviously had an aristocratic status there in Great Britain, but they needed money. They were financially destitute. In fact, here's Churchill. He gets automatic officership, in the British Army. He couldn't even afford his uniform. Back then, the aristocrats were expected, the officers in the British military were expected to buy their own uniform. Well, guess who stepped in and paid for his uniform, which is like equivalent to a middle-class salary for a whole year? It was Baron von Rothschild. He also gave a huge wedding gift to Churchill and his wife. He brought Rothschild to his villas in Austria and Switzerland and the Alps. He basically took him under his wing, and he made sure that the Churchill family always had money. And other Jewish elements in Hungary and Europe before the war, because Churchill was advocating for the Second World War early, and the Jewish establishment won a war, the Rothschilds won a war. He actually lined up money. I mean, we're talking about corruption, hundreds of thousands of pounds that were delivered from some of these Jewish oligarchs in Hungary and other places in Europe into the Churchill family. So the British people never realized that Churchill was being paid to advocate war. A war which, by the way, ultimately destroyed the British Empire. So Churchill was an agent of them now this is not David Duke, this is like conspiracy theory, right? Churchill was an agent of the Rothschilds, right? The interesting, and I'm working on a book now, and I've been doing a lot of research, and I read Martin Gilbert's book called Churchill and the Jews, and I read this book with total shock. I'm talking about shock and awe. I read this book, and it just floored me. Because in the book, my whole life, why don't you put up the Churchill article from the London, from the Illustrated paper? I think you've got that. Some of the things I sent you. It's probably at the bottom.
Yep, I have it here. Well, I have Martin Gilbert, Churchill and the Jews.
And there's another article showing the original article. That's the book, by the way. There's an article in there showing there should be an article. The Churchill article, I think, is listed in there somewhere. It should be part of the documents I've sent to you. It's a very famous article. It's called Zionism versus Bolshevism, a struggle for the soul of the Jewish people. It's further down. By the way, that's another typical article from the Washington Post. Here's something there's part of it. Let's go back a second. Now, what we're seeing here, and I can't read that, but let me see if I can.
I can read it, maybe. So
yeah, read the part in red. Now, this is right. What here? Let me set up what this is about. So Churchill wrote an article called Zionism versus Bolshevism, a struggle for the soul of the Jewish people. Now, in this article, Churchill says openly that Bolshevism is an international movement by Jews, and that Trotsky, that they intended, this is what Churchill says, that they intended the Jews through communism to rule the world. Now, this is what Churchill wrote, and he said that the Jews had control over the Russian people, that they were committing mass atrocities and murders and everything. And so I and many other people in the alt-right, and before that, I guess the conservative movement and the pro-Western movement, would look at this Churchill article and say, this is a great article, because it does show and proves the Jewish role in the communist movement. And then I read Martin Gilbert in this book. Read that, the one in red, and you can see something of what I'm talking about.
Leon Trotsky, who had been born Jewish but rejected Jewish national aspirations, has attacked the Zionists generally, and Weizmann in particular. The cruel penetration of Trotsky's mind leaves him in no doubt that his schemes of a worldwide communist state under Jewish domination are directly thwarted and hindered by this new ideal which directs the energies and the hopes of Jews in every land towards a simpler and truer and a far more attainable goal.
Okay, so there he's talking about how that Trotsky saw, and I do believe that the Jews worldwide, their leadership, saw the rise of communism as a means for Jewish power worldwide. And it really is part of the Jewish messianic view, because if you read the Talmud, they basically say in the Talmud that they are destined to rule the world. The Talmud says that every individual Jew, for instance, will have 5,600 slaves, which is about the Jewish proportion of the population. And this is crazy stuff, but this is a messianic religious supremacy. Also, so what he says there in this article, by the way, when he talks about Trotsky and he talks about the facts of the Bolshevik Revolution, Martin Gilbert does not refute anything Trotsky says. What Churchill says. So Martin Gilbert, the historian, he doesn't say, well, this was incorrect. He doesn't say one word. And it seems like because he's promoting, Churchill, that he would try to say, well, this isn't true. He doesn't say that. He doesn't.
So was this biography done before the war, after the career of Churchill? When was it done?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
So the book that was written there, the biography of Churchill, was
this was
done
recently.
after?
This was done in the last 10 years, like 6 or 7 years.
Oh, okay.
So he's looking back. He's got a whole chapter of Churchill's article, and he's trying to explain this article, and suddenly the light went on in my head. Okay. Actually, I discovered that the Churchill article was itself a bit of controlled opposition. Because, and this is what's amazing. See, Churchill was already working for them at the time. And everybody at that time, in 1917, the head of Scotland House in London, which was the world, that was their central intelligence agency of Great Britain at the time, the British Empire. They issued a report that went to every country, and you can find this, folks. It's easy to prove. They issued a report that was sent to every government, including our government. Now, I found this. I researched it. I even made sure that this was a true document. I found this in the National Archives of the United States. Other people reported it, but I went to go look at it myself because I wanted to make sure this was accurate, because it's an amazing document. So what they called the Scotland House, which is like Scotland Yard, the Scotland House, which was the British intelligence network, sent a report to every government in the world. And they listed all the communist movements all over the world. And they showed the Jewish role in all these movements in every country. And the first line of this report from the British government, they went to the entire world at this time, said, quote, communism is an international movement controlled by Jews. So this is a perfect example of the fact that these are all down the memory hole now. We don't even allowed to know about these things. It's Orwellian.
So that was Great Britain intelligence agency stating that.
Yeah. And they also sent a copy to our president of the United States. They sent it to our government, and you can find it in our national archives. It was sent to all these countries. You can get this long report. So at that time, everybody, even though it doesn't seem like that today, because that's all we have a controlled media today, everybody knew that communism was something that was sponsored by the most powerful forces of Jews. Then their economic power, the Jewish capitalists, by the way, which is another good example of the capitalist communist thing. It's not really the enemy we think. Why would rich, super rich capitalists support communism? It doesn't really make any sense, does it? So,
it's a
but
big
the
jump
reason
along
was
the political spectrum of the left and the right.
yeah, the reason was it wasn't a question of ideology. It was a question of racial or ethnic supremacy. They saw it as in the interest of the Jewish people. They saw the Tsar, the Christian Tsar of Russia, as an enemy of the Jews, and they called him anti-Semitic because he did the May laws in the 1880s, which protected the Russian peasants who were being exploited. So going back to it, so here's Churchill, and he's writing this story, and he says, "Oh yes, the Jews are behind communism, and oh yes, the Jews are committing mass murders in the Soviet Union, and communism is a tremendous threat to civilization and all the values, but the way we're going to fight communism and the way we're going to keep communism from prospering is by supporting the Zionists. Because the Zionists are good people. They're the people of the book. They're the people of the Bible, and you know, they gave us this great heritage, so we got to support the Zionists." But as I discovered, as we talk about with Jacob Schiff, you know, that was just a big con. Because the Zionists themselves, and Israel was, you know, the Zionists who created Israel, many of them were communists. And the communist movement, who were also favorable. I'll give you an example. The head of the propaganda for, and anybody can check anything I'm saying here, folks. The head of propaganda for the Bolsheviks during the Second World War was Ilya Ehrenberg. And if anybody ever deserved to be prosecuted for war crimes and mass murder and promoting mass murder, was Ilya Ehrenberg. He literally wrote pamphlets for the Russian troops saying he literally said he promoted the mass murder. And it was, again, against the, they saw the Poles as anti-Semitic. And in fact, when the Bolsheviks came into Poland, they captured most of the elite army officers of Poland. Mm-hmm. Because when the Germans came in, they fled to, many of them fled to the east, right? And then the communists came in. Now the Germans, after they defeated the Polish army in the beginning of the war, they freed all the Polish officers. They freed all the Polish prisoners. They let them go home almost immediately. After the Second World War, we kept the Germans in prisons and in horrible conditions, in some cases, for years. They didn't have any war crimes trials for them. They didn't prosecute them. They didn't, even when there were some cases, they actually let them return home. But the Bolsheviks, when they came in, they grabbed 15,000 Polish army. This is the aristocracy of Poland. This is like the elite of Poland. They took them to the Caton Forest and they murdered them. Now, the Germans immediately, when they came into that area of Poland, when Barbarossa started, when they were at war against the Soviets, they discovered these mass graves. And it's obvious, any forensic test is that the Germans couldn't have done this. But still, the world was told to a great deal in the war that the Germans had done this, even though they had international inspectors from Great Britain. So this kind of stuff was all promoted by Ilya Ehrenberg. Now, Ilya Ehrenberg, just a small example of this. Now, here he was, a Russian hero, his head of propaganda for the Bolshevik army in Europe. So eventually, he dies. So what does he do? As soon as after the war, he becomes a big Zionist, right? And he is now honored in Yad Vashem. The Holocaust. You got to pinch yourself to really believe this is true. And he willed his papers. He didn't give his papers, his private papers and historical government papers. He didn't give them to Russia. Guess who he gave them to? The Jewish state of Israel. So even though he was a communist, he was ultimately loyal to the Jewish state of Israel over communism when Zionism came about, because this was the great shift. When, originally what I think happened was a lot of the Jews, when there was no state of Israel, it was just a dream, an idea. They saw Bolshevism as a practical way to take over the world. right? To really get back at these Gentiles who they called anti-Semitic, and these damn Christians who they have thousands of books telling you how evil Christians are because they persecuted Jews. There's nothing about the other side of that equation. You know, the New Testament is full of Jewish persecutions of Christians, by the way. You know, and it's in fact it's packed with it, like Second Thessalonians, where it says, "And the Jews crucified our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and drove us out, and to keep us from teaching to the Gentiles, and despise all men," right? "And they've run us out of our homes and our lands." It sounds like the Palestinians today, and they sounds like what's happening to Europeans today. And he says, "But God's wrath has come upon them at last." So they considered Christianity to be an evil force, and they're still doing that. If you watched the Emmys the other day, I didn't watch them, but I saw a clip from the Emmys, and they really attack Christianity. They say the only people who, you know, praise Jesus are, what was the word for it? White males and white country people and crackheads.
They said that on the Emmys.
Yeah, I mean, it's all still going on today. You know, Sarah Silverman says if Jesus came back, she'd crucify him himself. This hatred. And yet, in our controlled media, nobody questioned Clinton in the debates. I mean, remember when Mr. Wallace, who's also a Jewish supremacist, remember when he attacked Trump saying, "You didn't denounce David Duke quick enough. What's your explanation for that? David Duke is a terrible guy. You got to denounce David Duke. Why didn't you do that?" You know, and blah, blah, blah. But he didn't ask Hillary Clinton in the debates. He was there in some of those debates. He didn't say, "Would you denounce at the Democratic convention being endorsed by Sarah Silverman, who said, quote, if Jesus came back, she'd crucify him herself. And she hoped the Jews did crucify Christ. She's Jewish herself. And said, don't you feel this is terribly offensive against the 80% Christians in America, isn't it? So will you denounce that?" And they didn't ask her to denounce the former communist Bernie Sanders, who was at a Stalinist kibbutz. And by the way, why is Bernie Sanders never headlined Bernie Sanders, former communist? Why is Nelson Mandela never headlined former communist terrorist Nelson Mandela? But why is David Duke always former KKK, even though there's not a single allegation of even hatred, really, if you actually look at what I actually say, and certainly no violence or anything like that. So this is where, you know, so here's Churchill. He's saying, okay, you know, the communists, yeah, they're terrible. We got to fight the communists. But the way we fight the communists is by supporting the Zionists. But in reality, the Zionists and the communists were like this, right? Because Zionists were running the New York Times. They were supporting the communists. Mm-hmm. Zionist bankers and the Rothschilds were supporting, right, Zionism at the same time supporting communism. And this was not just true in America. It was true all over the planet in every major nation. My book, The Secret Behind Communism, goes into this at depth. So these are the kind of things that I discovered as a young man that really shocked me and made me start questioning everything about what I learned. And I realized that we were giving, there's no reason, there's no wonder that so many boomers, when they only had 3 TV networks and everything was controlled in broadcast media plus the movies, there were no movies made about we entered the Second World War where the communists are already slaughtered 20, 30 million people. So that's the beginning. So I like to use, and my book, you know, talks about the communist Holocaust. Again, as I've said, we never hear about the communist Holocaust, and that's a word used by our United States Congress. But for some reason, we don't talk about the communist Holocaust. There are no movies really about it. There's no movies. And it's not just 100 million people killed. Hundreds of millions of people were taken from their homes, which they struggled for their whole lives. They were dispossessed. They were thrown out. Millions more were put into camps, just torturous camps called the gulags. And things like the Holodomor was visited upon, for instance, the Ukrainian people by these Jewish Bolsheviks. It wasn't the Russians, even though it was a Russian state. And I understand why the Ukrainian, we can talk about that issue in a little bit. I understand why the Ukrainians have a lot of anger against quote Russia, because it was once communist. But in the National Archives, in fact, I was with Solzhenitsyn a couple of these times. We dug up documents on the Holodomor in which 7 to 11 million Ukrainians were murdered by the Soviets. And the guy that was behind that murder was Kaganovich. He was the guy who was in charge of that mass murder. He was the deputy premier of the Soviet Union under Stalin. The guy that actually committed the mass murder was a guy named Gingrich Yagoda. Had a little mustache, about this big. In fact, if you saw a picture of him, many people think it was Hitler. But it wasn't Hitler. It was Gingrich Yagoda. And I've got a copy of the Ynet News, which is the biggest website in Israel, and one of the most major magazines in Israel, Ynet News. And the headline is, that it's called Stalin's murderers. I mean, this is for Jewish knowledge in Israel. It's for Jewish papers in the state of Israel. It's not for Jewish-owned newspapers like the New York Times, for Americans. And we're not allowed to know about the greatest murder of all time. Like I said, I mean, you think about what this establishment's done. And, of course, they led us into the Iraq War. We're not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk more about Russia. But everything that's going on, you can see what happened was, and this is, I would like to go into some of the documents about the rise of communism in Russia, because a lot of people still don't believe it. In Churchill's article, he said, with the notable exception of Lenin, that all the leaders were Jews. And by the way, Lenin actually, and I've seen this in the National Archives, in fact, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great dissident, the Nobel Prize-winning Russian dissident, showed me the first time I saw this. He showed me, this is after I wrote My Awakening, so I missed that in my book. He showed me documents from the Russian government where they interview Lenin's family, his wife, children, and so forth. And every one of them says very clearly that Lenin self-identified himself as a Jew and his family as a Jewish family. That's how Lenin saw himself. And he also said horrible things against Russia. And yet still today, the popular vernacular is, quote, the Russian Revolution. And like Solzhenitsyn said to me in the quote in the beginning of my book, he said that you learned this thing about the Russian Revolution. He said the Russian Revolution wasn't a revolution by Russians. It was, a revolution by people who hated Russians, who hated Christians, committed the greatest mass murder of all time. No people suffered more under mass murder and oppression than the Russian people suffered, he said. And the reason why you don't hear about the greatest Holocaust in the history of mankind, he said, directly to me, he said, is because of the fact that the perpetrators now control the media. So every time you see a movie, folks, about the Holocaust or whatever, and nobody ever can endorse any sort of mass murder and obviously killing anybody, man, woman, or child, because of their ethnicity is not something that nobody endorses. But just remember, they don't show you. They have nothing to make you cry about, say, the Helgas or the Olgas, the Russian little Christian girls that were raped and murdered in the prisons. For instance, I gave a speech one time at the Mayakovsky Museum, which shows you the change in Russia. See, they still try to associate Americans with Russia of the Soviet era. But to show you how everything's changed, the Soviets, even when the Soviet government still existed as, quote, the communist government, Khrushchev got up before the Presidium and in front of the Duma and started outlining the mass murders that existed during the previous Soviet regimes. And to think that here I am in Russia, and I never dreamed that I'd spend 5 years or 6 years teaching in Russia and learning in Russia and getting my PhD in Ukraine. I never really saw myself as ever being in Russia, because I was raised against communism. My dad was a full colonel in the army. He went to Vietnam with the government after, during the war. And I was raised as a very strong anti-communist. I never imagined myself ever spending time or being in Moscow for 5 years. And here I am giving a speech in the Mayakovsky Museum, which is right across the street from the old prison, the Lubyanka prison. This is, without any question, the most infamous prison and the most infamous intelligence and secret police operation in the history of the world. It functioned for decades and decades and decades, raping women, raping the wives of people to get them to make confessions, raping their daughters, their children. I mean, they did this. This was not something that was rare. This was normal behavior, torturing their wives, torturing them. And to think that I was giving a big speech, against this, right across the street from the prison, that tells you how different Russia is today than the Russia was. And the reason why they hate Russia today is because the Russians overthrew the communists. The truth is, Russia is far freer than America is in many, many ways. I mean, you have much less. When I was in Russia for a few years, I was never once had any evidence of being tailed by any police officers. Nobody ever knocked on my door. I've been knocked on the door all across Europe for simply defending Europeans from mass immigration, right? No Russians. And here I am, an American, right? I'm American in Russia teaching. I actually lectured in some of their major academies, universities. I actually had many friends that I met in the government, but nobody was ever checking up on me. Nobody was knocking on my door saying, "What are you doing here in Russia?" They didn't even ask. And it's like here is where we have the massive police state in America. Mm-hmm. And we see what the FBI does. They're actually conspired against our sitting president, our duly elected president. There is no Russian meddling in the election. The meddling in our election is Israeli meddling in our election. That's the control, and the people control the New York Times. If the New York Times was owned by 8 people, totally controlled, 89% of the voting power of the Times, which decides any person hired or fired in that organization or what their editorial opinions are. If that was owned by 8 people who were loyal and dedicated to the Ayatollah, right, of Iran and the Islamic State of Iran, what would be said about it in our media? But it's like there's no worry about our most important newspaper, maybe the most important paper in the world, which is quoted all over the world, that this is controlled by people who are not giving you the American point of view, but are giving you the Zionist and the Jewish point of view.
Now, the communist regimes are often referred to as atheistic. What's the relation between the religions at that point in Russia when the Bolsheviks rise? What's happening with religion? Did they have religions before? Did they discourage religion after?
Well, again, there is a great movement even among Judaism that's atheist. So this is kind of a fight among them. But amazingly, a lot of Jews who are not even religious, well, like for instance, they say that half the people in Israel, Jews, don't even believe in God. There's a big article in USA Today written by Jewish authorities, Jewish, famous Jews, who talk about Judaism without God. And they point out that most of the Jews that go to synagogue in the United States of America don't actually believe in God. And how atheists actually can give the prayers, open atheists. You can't even imagine that in the Catholic Church or in an evangelical church, or some person openly calling themselves an atheist, leading the prayers and leading the hymns and supporting the people. This happens routinely. This is what they write. It's not what I write, right? So there has been this fight, and what I think happened in terms of, there's 2 things that happened. One is that Stalin came to power in Russia, and Stalin was a Georgian. He wasn't Russian, but he adopted the mantle of a Russian persona. He changed his name to Stalin, which is a Russian word meaning steel, and he liked being Russian, and he liked defending the Russian people. Totally in this Jewish milieu, in this cultural milieu. He even married a Jewish woman, I think, at one point. But as he got older, he became to realize that these Jews around him, like Sverdlov and Zinoviev and Radek and Kamenev and even the guy that was head of the secret police and Yagoda even, right? He realized that they were really ethnic supremacists. They were tribalists. And the interesting thing about Stalin was that he outsmarted them, basically. But he was a very ruthless man. And the story, this is a very interesting story if you got a second to hear the story about how Stalin took over.
Sure.
Okay, so Trotsky did a book, in fact, called Stalin, and he did a book about the revolution, and he has a postcard in the book, and I reprint this book in my book, this postcard, and it shows the leaders of the communist revolution, the top leaders. It shows Lenin, it shows Trotsky, it shows Zinoviev, Kamenev, Sverdlov, and Lunacharsky, who is a Gentile. And out of the whole postcard, 7 people they're all Jews, right? And he uses this to show that Stalin wasn't anywhere in there because he was such a minor figure. So what happened was these Jews were fighting each other, over the carrion of the poor Russian people that were being mass murdered. And they say, "Oh my God, we've got to appoint somebody to be head of secret police." And so they said, "Who are we going to appoint?" Well, they didn't dream that Stalin was a real threat to them because they were all Jewish. Now they were already in these cliques, supporting each other. So they said, "Oh, Stalin is just this lowly Georgian guy, right? He's a communist. We'll let him, because that's the only one we don't have to worry about trying to seize power." But Stalin used the secret police to actually follow these guys to get, and they got them through all this corruption and lies and anyway, so he used it very cleverly against them and ultimately took over. What Stalin understood is that and in fact a lot of the Jews I think understood this too in Russia. They weren't going to win this war against the Germans and the West. They weren't going to win this war through these communist ideologies, which a lot of people didn't even still believe in Russia. They had to resurrect Russian patriotism. So they changed the Internationale from an old from this communist, egalitarian worldwide hymn. They went it back to an old Russian hymn. They started talking about Mother Russia and the great Russian people and the historic Russian people that defeated Napoleon, blah, blah, blah. And what they did was kind of like Trump's done indirectly. He encouraged nationalism for the people. And even though Trump never gave white people direct support, everybody got the idea of who he was talking about. When we talked about make America great again. Mm-hmm. So it was totally overt in Russia, and he also knew that they were not going to win this war with all these Jewish lawyers. The only way they're going to win this war is by people that are really have good spatial intelligence. That's what fighters really have, and people that lead wars have spatial intelligence, which Jews are weak in. They're really good at verbal. He also realized that for them to win this war, that they've got to bring these really talented and brave and courageous Russians to the fore. And they did that. By the end of the war, the Russians had acceded to so many of the positions. And then by the end of the war, Israel was founded. And Trotsky, by the way, was killed by Stalin, as you know. And in fact, the Jewish communists still kind of hate Stalin. Some of them still like him. But they loved Trotsky. So after the war, when the state of Israel came about, Stalin saw all these Jews, which he thought were good communists, all now being crazy over Israel.
And many migrated.
People. So what they did was they purged the Jews out of the Presidium. They purged the Jews out of the top echelons. They even purged them out of the Duma. And to show you where Putin came out of, Putin was in the intelligence, in the KGB, of course. And so they were so afraid, when they realized the Jews were combining as a tribe for Jewish interests, not for Russian interests, not for the Russian state, but for the Jewish state, They actually, this is amazing to even think about this. They actually purged all of the Jewish members of their intelligence network in Russia.
Oh.
Now, interestingly enough, while this was going on, they still had all kinds of Jewish spies around the world, like in America, like the Rosenbergs who stole atom bomb to Russia, and the Sobels, and what's talked about in the New York Times article. But a lot of Jews, they were so devoted to communism, they just couldn't believe the Jews were losing out. And we didn't know at that time, and they didn't know who was all these guys in the KGB. They had no idea that the Jews had lost. And this is the beginning of the transfer of Russia, because most of the people that Stalin had around him by this time, except for Kaganovich, were Gentile Russians, who many of them were heroes in the war, and they were true Russian patriots, right? So at that point, it was only a matter of time, in my opinion, that Russians were going to get rid of communism. That now it's kind of like the Chinese; they weren't going to dump all the symbols. You can't hardly do that. Take down all the statues at first, but they started introducing private property again. They started introducing freedom of religion again, and they started building Christian churches. For instance, the famous Kaganovich, this evil guy I told you about earlier, one of the most famous church in Russia was the Church of the Savior. It's right on the banks of the Moskva. In fact, I used to live 200 yards from that church in the Dom de Naberezhny. And by the way, they called the Dom de Naberezhny the building I lived in. It was a building built by Stalin originally. So here's Khrushchev, right? A true Russian. He's up there saying, this is evil. You know, these murders were evil. This is not the way we're going to have our country operate. We're going to also let people have their Russian Orthodox faith. That's what binds the country together. So they became Russian Orthodox Christians. And over the last 3 or 4 years, Putin has actually built and has supported the building of 60,000 churches in Russia. And Putin actually says that he calls Russia a Christian nation. Now, our president used to call America a Christian nation. They haven't done that for quite a while. Trump's the first one that kind of says, well, we're going to say Merry Christmas again. But so that's what's really going on, and that explains what's happened. So back in the 70s and 80s, by this time, the Russians were really moving toward a nationalism. They were legalizing the church again. And by the way, I was going to tell you, the Church of the Savior was destroyed by Kaganovich. They put it down, and they tried to build a swimming pool where it was a little story. I know all these stories because I knew all the guys that told me the stories who are the insiders. So they tried to build a swimming pool, but the swimming pool wouldn't stay. It kept screwing up. It kept sinking, and it wasn't working. They said it was the work of God, the Christians. But eventually, after a while, the Russian government rebuilt the Church of the Savior, tried to build it back, which shows you the transformation of Russia. And it shows you why they hate Russia, because Judaism and the Jewish establishment has always been very viciously anti-Christian. And if you say that it's not anti-Christian, I hate to say it to anybody out there that says that, that's a lie, because it is. I mean, you can go to the Library of Congress, or you can go to Google search, and you can search for anti-Christian books, any sort of anti-Christian book. Look at the Passover plot, who wrote it. Look at the Jewish histories talking about the persecution of Jews by Christians. Just read the New Testament, for God's sakes. Anybody out there that question me, these Christian Zionists, read the New Testament. And that's why Jews have been arguing that they want to, that's why the Soviets originally, they made the New Testament a banned book. They burned the New Testament. And for a while there, they would act, if somebody dared to have a New Testament, they'd give them the death penalty. That's how bad it was in Russia. So, and we see the same thing in Israel. And even with these Christian Zionists who try to say, oh, we love Israel and all that, if you look at the Israelis and you look at their articles about them, they just despise the Christian evangelists. They make fun of them. They say we need them. It's, well, we got to make sure the Goy think that, this is really going to be good for Christianity. But they absolutely make fun of them. The head of the Christians and Jews United as a group was led by a Jew for years, a Jewish guy, not a Christian. And Judaism itself says that Christ in the Talmud, read Jesus in the Talmud, written by Peter Schaeffer, who's one of the top Jewish historians. He's head of the Judaic studies at no less than Princeton University. Read Jesus in the Talmud. In this, he said the Publishers Weekly did a story on this book, and this was their description of the book. What's so scandalous about this book? Well, this book shows that the Talmud says that the Romans had no part in the crucifixion of Jesus. They claim that the Romans didn't even take part in the crucifixion. That was done entirely by the Jewish Sanhedrin.
So that's according to the Talmud?
That's according to the Talmud. And that's documented by Peter Schaeffer, and it's also documented by the Jewish Encyclopedia. Jesus, in fact, even the Quran, and again, I'm not a fan of the Quran. I'm certainly not a Muslim, but it's so interesting when they talk about the murders of the Quran. Just go to the Talmud. You can get more corruption than you ever dreamed of. But even the Quran defends Jesus. Even among the Islamics, Jesus is considered their greatest prophet, even greater than Muhammad, believe it or not. The Iranians made a big film about the wonders and the God-given virgin birth of Jesus Christ. This is what we don't know. And the Quran itself defends Jesus Christ's character. And this is shocking, but the fact that we don't know anything about this, all the early Christians knew about it. In fact, Christians knew about all this up until the Second World War, when the globalist media was completely taken over. And that's why we don't get the truth about their role in communism.
All right, let's have a look at some of the reactions of the crowd. Watchdog Media sends $50. He says, 8 months in Ukraine is a comprehensive expose of an important part of the globalist war against Russia. Please take a look at some of the trailers on YouTube. I've taken a look at it before the show began. It is absolutely amazing. Raw footage from within Ukraine during the revolution. I believe it's around 2013. It's pretty spectacular. Ragnot Ufberg says, isn't the communist takeover of Russia recorded as an invasion by their own historian? But in the West, it's only reported as a revolution movement.
That's correct, and both those things are correct. And the hardest thing, and I guess we need to talk about Ukraine a minute, because that's we European peoples, whether we're Eastern European, whether we're Slavic peoples, or we're more Western people, Germanic, or whether we're Italian, or Mediterranean whites, or whether we're Anglo-Saxons or Irish, whatever we are, we cannot afford to kill each other anymore. And there's got to be a way that Ukraine and Russia can settle its differences without war, because a war would be tragic, and it could even cause a world war between us. So I can't tell you, I just love Ukraine. I got my PhD in Ukraine. It's a great university there, MAUP. It's got a 200-acre campus. It's got a school of law. It's an amazing university, and they've had international conferences on Zionism. That's why they hate them. They try to discredit them all the time, but they're a UNESCO accredited school with an UNESCO, United Nations educational thing. They've had members. When I did my doctoral thesis, they had sitting members of the Council of Europe on my challenge, where you have the academics that challenge you in your thesis. My thesis actually was Zionism as a form of ethnic supremacism. Now, you can't do that at a university in America, but they had the leading governmental figures in the country, the leading academics of the country. They even invited a couple academics from some other major, like what they called the Red Brick University, the main national university in Kiev. We say Kiev. Americans generally say Kiev, but actually what they say there is Kiev. But so they actually came, and some of their professors were willing to take part in my challenge, because they knew that the Jewish establishment would try to do anything they can to discredit me. But, I do have a doctorate from that university, and I'm very proud of that fact. So I really love the Ukrainian people, and I believe they're some of the most beautiful and talented and great people on the planet. And I also love the Russian people. And so it just breaks my. In fact, I dated a girl. I was with a girl for about 9 years who's half Russian, half Ukrainian. So that shows you how much I love both those people. And she looked like a Miss World. I got to tell you, but we're not together now. But it's not very easy being with a guy who causes the constitutional police to knock on your door every day in Europe. And when a woman wants to live a quiet life and wants to raise some children, and and she was an attorney herself. She was in the Human Rights Court in Russia. I met her in Moscow, and she worked under Putin, and she actually defended Russia. And she was a young lady. I'm a lucky guy, I know, but she was a very young lady. But she was an attorney, and she was actually representing the Russians against the Jewish oligarchs. That's another whole story, because after the so-called violent revolution, which was sponsored by the Jewish elements in the country, they even controlled the election. They supported Yeltsin. When that happened, these oligarchs came in and stole the country from the Russians. And many millions of Russians had horrible nutritional diseases. They weren't getting the vitamins they needed, the food they needed, starvation, and they were going hungry. And these oligarchs were amassing fortunes of billions of dollars in like a year. It was done through organized criminal behavior, assassinations, murder, bribery. We can just go on and on. Khodorkovsky was all part of that. Berezovsky, who was also supported the terrorists, just like the Zionists supported the terrorists in Syria and elsewhere. We can keep going there. Guzinski was actually the head of Jewish deputies in Russia, and he was also a media mogul and a big criminal. He was an organized crime boss. And Russia later indicted him, but of course he was given shelter in the West, where the Zionist influence is so big. And we could just go on and on with that. And that's one reason why they hate Putin. That's why they hate Russia today. And finally, it's important to understand this. The reason they hate Russia is not because they're communist. It's because they didn't sanction Russia when it was communist. We had trade deals with them. We supported them in the Great War, didn't we? Uncle Joe, all right? The truth is, they had these sanctions because Russia became free. And unfortunately, Russia is freer than we are. It's not Russian meddling in America, it's Israeli meddling. And it's people who have an allegiance to a foreign nation, who have the biggest lobby in our Congress, who are the biggest, overwhelming, the top 10 contributors, the money bags that supported Hillary Clinton, were all Jewish Zionists. George Soros, Chaim Sabin, I got to say that right, Chaim Sabin, Simmons, we can go right down the list. They were all Zionist Jewish oligarchs, basically in America. And that's why they hate Russia. And I'm not saying Putin's perfect, and I have many patriotic Russians who are good friends of mine who don't think Putin's doing enough. And they don't like, they say he's playing a deep game, but they say he shouldn't be playing this game because he gives a lot of lip service to Israel, much like Trump does. But one of the issues, and since we're getting this Russian conflict right now between the West and Russia and Israel, let's look at it this way. It is amazing that Netanyahu actually is able to go to Moscow, right? And here's what's interesting, okay? The world Zionist globalism, there's no question about it, and the world Zionist media is behind the sanctions against Russia. The absolute destruction of the Russian economy. They're trying to make the Russians starve. They're trying to make it difficult for them to pay their bills and have a decent life. They're doing everything they can to destroy these people, just like they did to the people of Iraq, and just like they did, we can go on, just like they did to Syria, just like they've done to Lebanon, and just like they're doing it to us in many ways. And so what they've done is, all right, so here it is, right? They say, okay, they are the ones who sponsored, like the neocons and the neo-left, including, by the way, Bernie Sanders, the communist Bernie Sanders, right? Who used to support Russia. He took his honeymoon in Soviet Russia. Now he's for sanctions against Russia, which shows you where we really are, right? It shows you what's really going on right now in our country. So here they are sponsoring sanctions, which means in the EU, we have the same thing. You have sanctions against Russia. So major European companies can't do business with Russia. So this is all sponsored by the international globalist Jews. So guess what Israel does? You think Israel boycotts Russia? No. Now they have an advantage, right? So now the
so they do
Russians are
commerce.
forced to do. Yes, exactly. So now so Israel, so the center of Jews gets all kinds of Russian trade and Russian money, and you know, they get all this business, and they also do it to another enemy of ours, which is China, by the way. And this is amazing to think about. Now, this is our longest ally, right? So here you have a policy which is bad for Russia, which they think is their enemy in Syria, but it's good for Israel because now Syria can get all the business that European companies should be getting with Russia, or at least a lot of it. Not enough to help Russia that much, but certainly it's a lot to help Israel and the interest of Israel. So there again, you can see this hidden hand becoming not so hidden if you just use your noggin and you just start looking at the facts on the ground. These facts are never brought out by Fox News or CNN or New York Times, though.
All right, Danman says, do you know about Fabio Grobert, Yoshka Grinberg, Felix Gurbich, the Jewish people who started communism in Cuba? Also, any truth to Castro and Che Guevara being Jews? He also says there was a Jewish person named Ricardo Wolf who funded Fidel Castro, who also became an ambassador to Israel after Castro took power, also helped Latin American communists as well.
Well, it's amazing how many people in communism turn out to have Jewish lineage. I've never proven it. A lot of anti-communists in Cuba have told me they've seen the documents that Castro is Jewish. I've never actually been able to track down the proof of this. But I've got another document for you to share, which I think it kind of tops off the evening, and we got more questions probably from the people. But I think this document really just says so much about the Jewish role in communism. Let me see if I can pull it up for you. Let's see here. We're going to get it up just a second. Okay, here you go. Do you have that? Did you have a Word document I sent you called The Jewish Forward, a Jew in Mao's China?
I do believe I have it. Let me check that.
Well, you can read it along with me, and you could actually just, guide it down the page if you want to, if you put the type in big so people can read along. I want to read to you from the first 2 or 3 paragraphs, and it says more than I could ever say about the Jewish role in communism. Now listen to this, folks. Now this is an article from the Jewish Forward, which is one of the most prestigious and powerful Jewish publications in America. The article is called A Jew in Mao's China. It's from July 9th, 2012 by Laura Goldman, written by a Jewish woman. Now wait till you hear this, folks. It says more than I could ever say. Here you go. Quote, even when I have been disfranchised from God and synagogue, I've always been culturally proud to be a Jew. So basically what she's saying there is she's a Jew by blood. She's a Jew by heritage. And she says, quote, which I believe is the driving force of Jewish tribalism. Anyway, she goes on, a source of that pride is the Jewish tradition of helping the oppressed and our involvement in social movements such as labor and civil rights. Until I saw the documentary The Revolutionary at the Philadelphia Independent Film Festival, I mistakenly thought that China, during the revolutionary period, was one country that had not felt the Jewish embrace, right? So, again, what she's saying is, I thought China was the one country that didn't really feel the Jewish embrace of communism, right? But she goes on. In fact, 85 to 90% of the foreigners helping the Chinese at the time of the communist takeover were Jewish. This included the daughter of the founder of the brokerage firm Goldman Sachs. who left the comfort of her Park Avenue home to assist the Chinese. Now, I want you to get all that. I got some more to read because this is such amazing, right? Here's Goldman Sachs, one of the biggest financial firms of America. Even then, in the 1930s, they were also instrumental in the collapse of the stock market in 1929, right? They're supporting the communists. We're talking about non-capitalist communists in Russia with their fellow Jews. Listen to this. And I think it's because they saw the Chinese would be an ally of at that time, the Soviets who were Jewish. Okay, quote. The revolutionary tells the story of Southern-born Sidney Rittenberg, the only American that's ever been admitted to the Chinese Communist Party. The Mandarin-speaking Rittenberg, who was initially sent to China by the U.S. Army at the time of Japan's surrender at the end of World War II, became an influential advisor to Mao Zedong and to the first premier of the People's Republic of China, Zhou Enlai. Okay, now, get this now, folks, really clearly, right? So here's the guy that was sent to China to represent American interests in China because we were trying at that time, after the Second World War, we were trying to fight for the non-communist, right, opposition to Mao Zedong. We didn't want this communist to come to power. We knew it would be a horrible issue for the people. And here he was. He wasn't fighting for America. He wasn't interested in American issues. He ends up being an advisor to Mao Zedong. All right? Let's go on. This gets even better, man. This is like stuff you can't even believe until you read it with your own eyes. All right. Here it goes. All right. His pivotal role at the Broadcast Authority, explaining the communist Chinese point of view to America, earned him a higher salary than Chairman Mao. So the guy over there that was defending the Chinese communists, these guys who are, by the way, had already killed tens of millions of people, was a Jewish guy who was obviously not loyal to America, ultimately to China. Listen to this. Rittenberg's life was not all that wonderful, however. Twice he was imprisoned by the communist leadership for a total of 16 years. Well, of course, they realized that he wasn't really interested in the Chinese. He had been in prison for a year during the first incarceration, but was offered the chance to leave if he returned to America and never came back to China. Although his first wife divorced him and rejected the offer, he believed he would be found innocent of Stalin's charges of being a spy and never dreamed he would spend 5 more years in jail. Released from jail after Stalin died, Rittenberg once again was embraced by the Chinese communists and returned to Broadcast Authority at its head. Boy, now, if you just take in all of this stuff, it's amazing. Now, right after the war, when he was influential under Mao Zedong, this is a time when 45 million Chinese were starved to death by the government. 45 million. This is according to most of the human rights researchers. This guy was an aider and abettor of the mass murder of tens of millions of people under communism. And
the Broadcast Authority, are we talking about the kind of propaganda ministry, or?
Yeah, he was head of the propaganda ministry for Communist China.
Okay.
So, I mean, this is the story. So remember that communism came out of the Communist International, which was Jewish. And in this article, she admits that 85 to 90% of the foreigners helping the Chinese at this time, the time of the communist takeover, were Jewish. So the people that brought communism to China, that caused the deaths of tens of millions of people, was certainly not in the interest of the United States. It was not in the interest of the Allies. It was not in the interest of the world. It was not in the interest of the Chinese or Jews. He's got so much blood on his hands. But this is a perfect example of the secret reality of the Jewish involvement in communism that we haven't learned. Now, this isn't something that I wrote. It's not something that I wrote in one of my books. When in fact, I don't even mention, well, actually, in my book, The Secret Behind Communism, I talk about other sources admitting that the people who brought communism to China were Jews. It's like, but this is something that is written in a major Jewish publication, and they're proud of the fact. They're proud of the fact that this Jewish guy brought communism to China, which ultimately they don't talk about that. There's no mention of the mass murders or the horrible tyranny that existed in that regime. They're proud of the fact that he brought communism to China.
All right.
I mean, what more do I have? Doesn't this illustrate everything I've been talking about in this broadcast?
First name, last name says, Dr. Duke, after the collapse of the USA, would you be in favor of a Canada-USA merger that creates a European-North American nation?
Well, I love the people of Canada, and it's so sad that the people of Canada have been under such a Bolshevik, Zio-led multiculturalism, which has betrayed every Canadian who made Canada great in the first place. And but I don't know if a merger is necessarily the right way. I do believe that we in Canada and we in America have the right to preserve our heritage and our countries. And for most of your existence, Canada as a nation and as a part of Western civilization was it was even more European American than America was for most of its existence as an entity, as a nation of Canada. And so I am dedicated to preserving our people and our country at the same time, making sure that if there is a separation or if there is a cantonship for certain minorities or if there is a relocation to another area, that this is done humanely and properly and voluntarily. I believe that most people tend to want to live in a society of their own. And I think that's true of non-white people. I think it's true of European people. And someday, without this massive control over us by the media and this propaganda, someday I believe that will occur, and both in Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the rest of the Western world.
All right. Ragnulf Ulfberg says the Holocaust is usually the longest history course. Sigmar asks, Duke, opinions on paganism and why you embrace Christianity, a non-European religion. The Germans knew in the 30s and were already implementing pagan customs. Embrace Wotan, my friend.
Well, I tell you something. There's a lot of parts of Christianity that actually have pagan roots. As you know, probably our Christmas celebrations, which come from winter solstice, and Easter. That certainly is part of our European traditions and heritage. And whatever you want to say about his lineage, and there are certain National Socialists, for instance, certain Germans, that believe that, in fact, Christ wasn't of Jewish lineage. And I think the Jews didn't consider him such. I don't know about that. But I do know that the doctrine of Christ is so alien to the doctrine of the Old Testament, even alien to the doctrine of the Talmud, incredibly so. In fact, the idea that a man would sacrifice his life and suffer a horrific death to save other people that's like a European ideal in a real sense, that he would sacrifice himself for his people, for the world. And so I like the values of Christianity when it comes to our families and when it comes to the way we should treat each other, a sense of brotherhood and a sense of social justice for people and moral values. So I have no problem with positive Christianity. I have no problem with a form of Christianity as our ancestors practiced it, which was a healthy Christianity. At the same time, I respect people of different beliefs. I believe in absolute religious freedom. And I believe that the Europeans will have the right to choose whatever religious values they have. I don't believe in any religious autocracy of any kind. But I'm a Christian, and I do believe that the foundations of Christianity were also the foundations that originally protected Europe in many ways from the invasions of some of the Jewish elements, for instance, in Russia. And the invasions of Europe were first united by this common Christian faith. Europeans came from all over Europe, went to fight with Charles Martel, who was one of my direct ancestors, by the way, great-great-great-great-grandfather 37 generations back. And that's according to my genealogist. I believe it's true. The documents prove it. But, it's like, Christianity was something that can be a positive to our society or it can be a negative to our society. And I believe that the alienation or the manipulation of Christianity, I believe that much of Christianity today is under the power of the Zionist influence in media and government and infiltration. And I believe that Christianity is compatible to the Western spirit as long as we have true Christians that are narrating this and Christians who do this. At the same time, I love European traditions and I respect all people of Europe. And the main thing I would suggest to my pagan friends or this individual here, look, be tolerant of those Christians as long as they're Christians that stand up against the Zio power, that stand up against the destruction of our European heritage. As long as they do that, be tolerant of them. And I would urge our Christians also to be tolerant of Europeans who don't endorse all aspects of Christianity or look to their ancient history. We can debate these subjects and we can argue these subjects, but I think right now what we've got to do actually is bind ourselves together to defend our European heritage. And I think any sort of division along those lines is counterproductive to our own survival, that of both paganism and truly Christianity and the people that make both of those cultural values possible.
All right, Loki Evala says, Jeff, your libertarianism has merit. My sticking point is, what would President JF do when corporations and sociopaths refuse to follow laws and work behind the scenes to screw people? Great show. We've had a debate on that, I believe it was 2 weeks ago or 1 week ago.
I think I know what you do. Can I suggest what I think you do?
What?
I think if they broke our laws and tried to destroy our country or betray our country, commit treason against our country and our people, you'd put them in jail and you'd give them the full penalty of the law.
Absolutely. Libertarianism is not in contradiction with having a police force. And it's not because someone is rich that they can screw you. The idea of libertarianism is to put the focus on consent. And so if these sociopaths and corporations were to do stuff against the consent of the people, they could be facing penalties. Ragnar Fulberg says, the USA has been broken of our manifest destiny. How many people would be alive if Marx never was? Well, those are hard calculations to make. Personally, I don't like putting all of the deaths of a century over one individual. I think intellectual frameworks emerge in society. There's also constraints, and it's impossible to know if there wouldn't be as much death with other regimes. Ice Wolf says, can't nuke the Duke. Dan Mans...
Let me respond to the thing on Marx for a second first before we can't nuke the Duke, hopefully. But I disagree with you on that. I think that Karl Marx refined the poisons to its utmost. He also uttered forth not simply an economic system of trying to be more fair or just or socially concerned about the well-being of people, but he also ushered in the Bolshevik type or Marxist type cultural milieu. And I think without Marx and without his Zionist teacher, Moses Hess, and if not for Marxism per se and Karl Marx's contribution, I think probably the world would have there may have been forms of communism that killed people, but I certainly believe that Marx was one of the greatest destructive forces of any individual in the world. And I also believe that the communism that he created, or that he created out of some sort of ethical socialism, that's the original foundation, was something that absolutely doesn't work. So the people that say that communism is a great theory and it's a great ideology and it's a great system, but it doesn't work in practice, tells me that the theory is not good either. Because if the theory was good, then in practice it would work. So I say that Karl Marx has, a lot of the responsibility for these mass murders and destructive nature of communism falls directly at his doorstep. But more importantly, to the tribe around the world, that without this tribe supporting the work of this son of a rabbi, without this tribe promoting it in media, in government, in academia, promoting it like with our mother's milk in our society to our kids even today, that these mass murders and this horror would not have taken place.
All right, Ramzin says, have you heard of the Assyrians, Mesopotamian Christians, allies to Britain in both world wars? The West should ally. Israel is a lousy ally.
Israel's worse than a lousy ally. It's not an ally that commits terrorism against you like in the Liberty attack, in the Levant affair where they blew up American installations in Egypt, of American communities in Egypt, expatriates, in order to try to blame the Egyptians and get us into another horrific war. Israel had the spy Jonathan Pollard, which did more damage to American values than ever. And that's what we had in America. We had a shift from the Jews spying for the Soviets, including our atomic bombs, but to spying for Israel. And that spying is still going on. And these Jewish extremists are still committing treason against America every day. It was treason to put us into the Iraq war based on lies and to cause 1 million Americans to face horrific injuries and suffering and early death because of this insane Zio Jewish-led war.
All right, Ragnar Fulbert says, the population demographics of America is almost lost, though. Does white America have a future if we don't close the border as soon as possible?
No, white America doesn't have a future unless we close the border as soon as possible. However, I would say this, when people count out white people or Europeans, we've always had a history of overcoming great odds. And I believe with the modern experiences of science, for instance, with modern robotics, with modern abilities to create incredible systems of production, even a small population somewhere in the world, whether it be even the country the size of Iceland, where you can make robots that can make robots. If you have a people of great intelligence and you have a people of great will, you could actually create a defense capability or an offensive capability if you wanted to, that would equal any superpower today. So the potential, the harnessing these computer issues that our own ancestors created the foundations for, like Dr. William Shockley, a friend of mine who really started Silicon Valley. I believe that if our people are dedicated to a survival, even if our numbers become low, we still have a great chance to save our people and to rebuild everything anew and better than ever was before. So I'm never giving up, and I do believe that as our European people get more and more information, the facts on our side, just like the facts we put over tonight, they're irrefutable facts. Once they learn the facts and they become dedicated to our own people's survival, I believe that we will eventually save our people and free our people and eventually create a society that will not only give us freedom and greatness and beauty at home, but will someday even take us to the stars.
All right, and finally, Frederick White says, did you know George Rockwell?
Well, I actually corresponded with George Rockwell, and I read everything he wrote, and he was an inspiring character to me. And when he was assassinated, I felt like I lost a father. So, you know, I think he was a great man. I think he realized his approach what needed to be changed, and he was changing it before his death. So he was changing the name of his group to a white people's organization. I think that was smart. But I think he was a very brilliant and very courageous man. And he was a commander in the Navy during the Second World War. And I think he really provided a great example for people to stand up, even though a lot of people might not agree with the methods he used or the motif he used. He was absolutely a hero for white people.
All right, wonderful. Was there anything else you wanted to cover concerning the
Well, if you want to take
Bolshevik
some
Revolution?
rapid fire, I think you got me down there. I'm answering the question within a minute of each question. If you want to ask me a few more questions, I could hang on for a little while longer if you'd like.
All right, we can hang out. Now, as a reminder to our audience, the book The Secret Behind Communism by David Duke is on sale. There's 2 links in the description. You can buy it directly from David's website, or you can go on Amazon. And you're showing My Awakening also?
Yeah, there's
My
My Awakening.
Awakening, absolutely.
Major book.
Major book,
It's
that's
over
what...
1,000 footnotes. Everything is documented, and I promise you, and I've had so many people. It's been read by 500 million people now across the world, and you can get a free copy. And again, I'm not just selling it. I mean, I appreciate you buying the book, and we need your support. And you can get it through Amazon or through our website, and you can donate to my work as well. First, donate to our good friend here who's doing this show. But this book will change your life. And I really believe it will give you so much data and so much powerful argument for your friends and your family. And I think you're going to find it the best read of your life. And I think the audio version is something you can listen to while you jog, while you walk, while you hike, while you work out. And I believe the audio version of this life is totally free. And just make sure when you go to archive.org to download the book, that if you don't hear the opening music in the book, you've got the old edition. Don't waste your time. Just download the other edition of My Awakening, and you'll hear music introduction to the beginning and the end of every chapter. So I urge you to do that, but that's all free for you, and it's my gift to you and all of you who want to stand up for our people.
All right. And someone asked, does he know James Mason? I didn't know about him. It seems that he's played in the fall of the Roman Empire and he was an actor in England and then became one of Hollywood's biggest stars.
I've seen movies of James Mason, but I don't know much about him.
All right, wonderful. So I think that's it for tonight. We will keep the video short because that's what leads to people wanting to watch the video in full. Dr. Duke, it was a pleasure to have you, and we can do that again anytime.
We've been talking about topics, and I love this Friday night business. Why don't we do a show on everything concerning health, fitness, longevity, cognitive ability? Let's just do a show on all the aspects of how to improve our individual lives. What I've learned in my 68 years that I think can contribute to the young people and the middle-aged people and the older people who watch your program. I would love to get into a little debate with you about that. I'm sure we're not going to agree on everything, but I would love to go into some of the ideas that I have about health, fitness. I've studied that a lot. It's my second love next to politics. I've spent 2 or 3 hours a day for the last 30 years of my life reading about the best way to get fit, the best way to be healthy, the best way to not become ill, the best way to extend life, the best way to continue to keep your cognitive ability. And I'm 68. I hope that I was very cognitive in this program today, folks. But I want to not only live a long life, but I want to drop dead healthy at the end of my life. I don't want a long period of sickness. And I can't guarantee that's going to happen with me, but I really do study the science and not anecdotal stuff. And I'd love to have a show with you about that. And you can give your thoughts. I can give my thoughts. We can also go into methods of organizing your life. Mental attitudes will help you achieve more in your life. Different aspects. We can even talk about some aspects of meditation, even though that's not the biggest thing that I'm concerned about. But we can talk about all sorts of elements of how to make our life stronger, how to live a life more of our dreams rather than the things we wish for. And if you'd like to do that next week, I would love to prepare for that and have that kind of discussion with you.
All right, let's do that next week. Now, I have a PhD in exercise physiology, but I hate exercise. However, maybe we can combine this with diet, and then maybe I can talk about cooking, which is much more fascinating to me.
Wait, you said cocaine?
Cooking.
Oh. You threw me for a loop there. You know, the sound's not that loud here in the computer. Well,
All
I'm
right.
glad it wasn't cocaine. But we can talk a little bit. It's a very interesting subject about nicotine, and there's a lot of evidence that nicotine is actually kind of a neurotropic, that it can be good for the brain. To
Absolutely.
give people a little preview of that, when they studied hundreds of thousands of people who smoked, and they found out that smokers had 3,000% more chance of contracting cancers. The one thing they found out, which they didn't quite understand, was that smokers also tended to have much, much lower rates of dementia and Alzheimer's, this type of thing. And they said, well, they didn't understand this. They didn't release those kind of figures. I'm not suggesting people smoke, but it could be a very limited amount of nicotine occasionally, like a nicotine gum or vaping, very limited amounts. Can maybe be good for your cognitive abilities and your memory, and keep maintaining that as you get older.
All right, let's talk about this next week. It was fascinating to hear about the rise of communism in various parts of the world. David Duke, thank you so much for coming.
Great to be with you. Congratulations
Bye
for your
bye.
great show.